Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the Prepper Historian and share this with someone who values real history, not surface-level trivia. What you're about to hear isn't recycled ration book talk. These are food strategies pulled from wartime diaries, civil defense manuals, and post-war interviews that most documentaries skip entirely. If you've studied World War II long enough, you already know that starvation didn't always come from a lack of food. It came from visibility. In occupied Europe, the United Kingdom under U-boat pressure, and even parts of rural America during rationing, families learned quickly that the most dangerous thing you could do was look well-fed. Gardens were raided. Livestock was confiscated. Anything obvious attracted attention from soldiers, neighbours, or officials. So people adapted quietly. They didn't just grow food. They hid it in plain sight, underground, behind walls, and inside structures no one thought to search. What follows are 6 forgotten food sources families relied on, and, you know, how the same thinking still applies today if supply chains break again. Why Jerusalem artichokes became the invisible survival crop. Jerusalem artichokes were a gift to families who needed calories without attention. They look like sunflowers above ground, which made them appear ornamental or wild, but underground they produced heavy, starchy tubers that could survive frost, neglect, and repeated harvesting. Families in France and Eastern Europe planted them along fence lines, bombed lots, and roadside ditches where soldiers ignored them. The tubers stayed edible even when left in frozen soil, allowing people to harvest only what they needed. Today, the lesson is simple. Grow calorie-dense food that doesn't resemble standard vegetables. Plant them where no one expects food to exist, and, well, harvest slowly to avoid patterns. How rabbit pens were disguised as scrap piles and sheds. Rabbits were one of the most efficient protein sources of the war, but obvious hutches were targeted for confiscation. Families began hiding rabbit enclosures inside collapsed sheds, under stairwells, or behind stacked firewood designed to look abandoned. In the Netherlands, some households kept rabbits entirely indoors, feeding them kitchen scraps and forage collected during walks. Practically speaking, this shows how protein sources don't need to be visible or smell strongly if managed correctly. Even today, small livestock can be concealed within existing structures if noise, waste and visibility are controlled deliberately. Why potatoes were grown under floors, not in fields? Potatoes kept millions alive, but open fields were watched. In Britain and parts of Germany, families dug shallow pits beneath wooden floors, coal storage rooms, and even animal stalls, planting potatoes in soil-filled boxes or trench beds covered by removable boards. The warmth from homes accelerated growth, while inspections rarely included tearing up floors. So, modern application means, well, thinking vertically and, internally. Basements, crawl spaces, and even insulated sheds can actually grow food quite discreetly, as long as you manage light and ventilation carefully. Here's the thing. Wartime families actually used weeds as deliberate food sources. Dandelion, lamb's quarters, nettle and purslane weren't just emergency foods, they were planned crops, honestly. Families would encourage these so-called weeds to grow in hedgerows, cemeteries, rail embankments and rubble piles, mainly because, well, no one suspected intentional cultivation. Nettle soup and dandelion greens provided absolutely critical vitamins when, you know, scurvy became a real threat. So, why were beehives hidden in ruins and attics? Well, honey was more than just a sweet treat. It was medicine, a source of precious calories, and, honestly, a real boost to morale. In those occupied regions, folks moved their beehives into bombed-out buildings, church towers and attic spaces. You know, places where soldiers just wouldn't bother climbing. Bees, you see, forage freely, producing food without the need for visible fields at all. Some families, quite cleverly, even disguised their hives as debris piles. If you think about it, applied today, this really reminds us that food doesn't always have to grow in soil. Now, let's talk about how grapevines and fruit trees were trained to look decorative. Fruit trees, of course, were obvious targets for anyone searching for food, but those carefully trained vines, well, they weren't nearly as easy to spot. Families espaliered grapevines along walls, arbours and alleyways, making them appear ornamental while producing steady sugar and nutrients. In Italy and southern France, figs and grapes were blended into architecture so completely that occupiers ignored them. The modern lesson is integration. When food production looks like decoration or infrastructure, it survives scrutiny. These strategies weren't clever tricks. They were quiet systems built by people who understood that survival depended on restraint, patience, and invisibility. The families who lived weren't always the strongest or the best supplied. They were the least noticeable. If this kind of deep, practical history matters to you, subscribe to The Prepper Historian, share this with a fellow researcher or preparedness-minded friend, and stay with the channel. History still has lessons we haven't finished learning.